What up, everybody? Today we're going to talk about the 3 pillars of game design, how to design a game consciously for them, why I don't think 1D&D, Project Black Flag, Pathfinder 2.0, or Dungeon World are going to work out for me for this, and what I'm going to do about it, which, spoiler alert, is design a game with you. Live. Every Thursday. But we'll get there. First, what are the 3 pillars of game design and why do we care? Well, designing a game consciously around the pillars makes sense. D&D has inherited sort of a weird kind of amalgam of rules that then got consolidated over time. WotC did a great job taking these weird disparate systems that people came up with on the fly to educate the game in the past with other games that they threw in and cobbled to get various pieces of the game together, and they went, hey, you know what, let's just do everything with a d20 roll and get rid of THAC0, because THAC0's weird. THAC0's weird. I started with second ed. THAC0 is weird. But anyway, they did a great job of that, but there's a difference between kind of designing something consciously with something in mind, like games that have been written since D&D that kind of came up with a system first and then kind of built the game around that system, versus D&D, which was kind of an amalgam. They did a good job making it not an amalgam anymore. 5e works pretty well, but there's some issues. Partially, I'm still a little bit weary of a very predatory monetization ecosystem. I don't really want to get involved in that. I don't want to feel pressured by it. I don't think you do either, because that's why you're here. But anyway, the 3 pillars of game design. Let's just go into that so I don't ramble and get way off track. These are the 3 pillars of game design. This is adventure design, but it's basically the same idea. I'm going to try to build the entire game around these 3 pillars. And that's exploration, social interaction, and combat. Pretty straightforward. However, one thing I've noticed is, no, it didn't change. It just looked like it changed on my screen. One thing I did notice, however, is that in kind of modern games, especially 1D&D, and I've got some stuff about this on my other videos, you want to check those out, they kind of look more like this. Exploration is kind of the poor cousin, and even social interaction has its own issues if you look at the influence action and the things that are written down about it, but I'll get into that later. Exploration seems to be sort of the forgotten child. A lot of the exploration rules never really got any kind of good updates since old school D&D, like Encumbrance. There's been some updates, but it's still kind of a clunky system when you're measuring weight. One version, the Dungeons and Dragons game, I want to say it's like Moldvay or something. I'm not 100% sure. For me, it was a black box, a big red dragon going, ah, that was way too human. Like, somebody like drew a guy and then turned him into a dragon. It was weird. It was a guy with an axe gonna, hit him. That game had, what do you call it? That game, wow, I just lost track of myself. That game had everything measured in coins, because the idea was you're pulling treasure out of the dungeon, so coins became the kind of currency of Encumbrance, which was pretty cool. And something similar to that might be a good idea, but that's one of the exploration rules that never really got updated and kind of got thrown out. Most people don't use it. Maybe you do. If you're using digital resources, you tend to use Encumbrance because it's not that difficult to just write down weights on a digital character sheet and let it calculate it for you. But people that are actually playing with paper tend not to use it because it gets in the way. Another big exploration issue I've noticed, and I've talked about in some of my past videos, is how the species in D&D, 5e, 1D&D, almost all of them get dark vision, a lot of them get flight. It's just those kind of wreck classic puzzles. I recently ran, kind of going back to this picture, an adventure where you had pillars like this in a room. They were about 10 feet apart from each other, and you could jump from pillar to pillar to get across the room without falling down to the floor and then getting attacked by skeletons. You didn't know you got attacked by skeletons, it was just dead adventurers down there, but if you fell, every person that fell, one skeleton would animate. It was a first level adventure in Dungeon World, but not the point. It was originally designed for 5e, so it works. But that doesn't work if everybody can fly. It doesn't work if everybody can glide, right? You're not afraid of falling at that point. You're not afraid of it's just, and you don't have to worry about light. Although that adventure, everything glowed blue because of the nature of it, but other adventures, you're going to need a light source. Two of the characters could cast light spells when I was running that campaign, and they were in a sewer, and I was like, all right, there's no light. And the poor fighter was like, I got to stick near the rogue and paladin because they can cast light and I can't because the paladin got cleric spell. We were running Dungeon World. It got weird. They all multi-classed. It was fine. But anyway, so that's why it looks like that. So let's talk about the 3 pillars and how we can try to be conscious of this for... Why is that? I'm just going to hit OK. So we can be conscious about these for game design. Because the idea is that if you consciously design your game around these things, you're not going to make the mistakes that have been made in other games. So first, let's talk about the combat pillar. Things to keep in mind with the combat pillar, mostly for combat, you just want to keep combat flowing. D&D combats tend to drag a bit. It helps if you can put some sort of a timer on the system, get people invested in, all right, in 3 rounds, the entire floor falls away, we all die. So we got to keep that in mind, right? When you get timers going, that does help make D&D combat faster. When you have goals in the combat besides complete annihilation of one side, that helps. But hit points do tend to drag combat down. One of the reasons that people tend to stop playing around level 7 is because that's when it starts to get real draggy. If you want to see why I'm doing... One of the reasons that I'm doing this as a live stream and not as edited videos is because I am terrible at video editing. And I bring that up because if you want to see sort of a discussion about hit points with terrible video editing, go check out my Bounded Hit Points video. It is... The editing is terrible. The sound quality is just atrocious. I finally have a good microphone. But I did not have a good microphone before. And the sound quality is really, really bad. It's like embarrassingly bad. But I'm keeping it up because that's what you do on YouTube. You keep up your videos and hope people watch them. But I noticed that around, double starting hit points is roughly where you want to be for hit points in D&D. Beyond that, it starts to get kind of sloggy and kind of just people get like unrealistically tough. So that's about all I'm going to say about the combat pillar. Oh, I am going to compare D&D to Dungeon World. So D&D, let's say you have a fighter run into a room to fight 3 goblins. In D&D, that's 2 initiative rolls. And then the fighter's turn, they make some actions. They attack a goblin, and the goblin attack. Then 3 goblins attack the player. So that's like an initiative roll. The fighter rolls an attack, and 3 goblins roll an attack. It's 5 dice rolls being adjudicated. Wow, I cannot speak English today. Anyway, but that's like 5 rolls, where in Dungeon World you'd be like, oh wow, alright, there's 3 goblins in there, I attack the goblins, and you make 1 roll. That is one way in which Dungeon World, I think, works better than D&D for combat. The problem is, in D&D, fighting 3 goblins is 3 separate attacks, which is a time sink. But it's 3 separate attacks. I could take, D6 here, D6 here. I could take 18 damage, right? Maxed out. Where in Dungeon World, when 3 goblins attack 1 player, if the player gets hit, you would roll 3d6, because I think goblins do d6 in Dungeon World, and if I'm wrong, oh well. You can look it up if you have the Dungeon World rules. I do, over there somewhere. But you'd roll 3d6 and just keep the highest of the 3, and that's how Dungeon World does the damage. So it's not quite as threatening, and I really got to shut off, Discord, because I am getting the Discord beeps all the time, and I hope that's not annoying to you, because it's annoying to me. But anyway, it's the problem with doing this live. I forgot to shut off Discord. I had to restart my computer whole thing with my video card. Long story, don't want to get into it. But anyway, that's how Dungeon World compares to D&D. So Dungeon World's faster, much faster paced, but D&D is much better with the tactics, because you got, 3 goblins, that's 3 different people that could attack you, that's this, that, you get positioning and all this other stuff. I want to be somewhere in between those two, where I wanted to be faster like Dungeon World, but tactically crunchy like D&D. And if I can get to that sweet spot, that's where I want to be. and that's where I'm going to need your help on that. But that's not the point. Now let's talk about the social pillar. So, D&D, the social rules in D&D were always a little bit weird. I feel like, basement trolls that never actually talk to people writing social rules didn't always work out the best. I apologize. Just insulting Gary Gygax. I apologize for that. That was uncalled for. But the social rules in D&D were never that great. But they were usually in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But one of the last D&D documents I read that I paid attention to was the one where they put the influence as an action. And they put those DM rules into the player's handbook and said, hey, this is how it works now. Plus, they made skills auto-succeed on a nat 20. It used to be just attacks auto-succeed on a nat 20, but in 1D&D, they decided to make skills auto-succeed on a nat 20. Which brings me to the idiot demanding that the king hand him his crown. I got a natural 20, I'm the king now. It's like, no. In my game, if you walked up to the king of a kingdom and said, give me your crown, and rolled a nat 20 on persuasion, the king would laugh and offer you a job as court jester. That's the best you would get from that situation. Otherwise, you'd probably get murdered. Because no king is going to... I'm shutting down something right here. I apologize if that flicked out funny. I am really getting annoyed with Discord right now. Alright, hopefully that will end that. Okay. Hopefully that fixed that. But anyway, because no king is going to hand over his crown. There's certain things that it will never be successful in a social interaction, and the role shouldn't be determining whether or not someone's going to do something. Dungeon World also makes a similar thing where if you have leverage over someone, which is the only social role they have in the games, if you have leverage over someone, which is weird in and of itself, you can get them to do a thing, and you have to promise them something, and if you do really well, you just have to promise it. You don't actually have to give it to them. If you're in the middle, you have to give it to them first before they'll do the thing for you, but they'll do the thing for you. And that, it's not as bad as that influence action, but it's still not great. So the goal here is to get the social pillar to work out well for the gameplay. Now, the social pillar, interestingly enough, in old school D&D was kind of its own sort of thing because the combat was really deadly in old school D&D. Like, at 0 hit points, you were just dead. New character, we're going to shred your character sheet. You're dead. And you had like 1 to 6 hit points in really old school D&D, depending on which edition you're playing. So, yeah, you wanted to avoid combat. The social pillar in old school adventures was mostly, hey, maybe we can talk these goblins that are not attacking us so we can save our resources for the real fights later. So that's what you did. Old school D&D, because of the deadliness of combat, also had more on the exploration pillar because you're trying to find ways around combats to avoid them, which I'll get to in a minute. In fact, I think it's time for me to go to the exploration pillar. But just to sort of finish out the social pillar, you want to make sure that your social rules make sense based on how actual social interactions work. One example is I took a class on charisma, and yeah, it's kind of weird. But one thing that they said was if you're trying to get into something, like, let's say, I'll put it in D&D terms. If your players are trying to get into a social club that only the nobility can get into, and they're not nobility, they're not going to be allowed in, right? Well, one thing that they say that you can try to do is, to talk to a bouncer is be like, instead of trying to be like, oh, I'm a noble, and lie that you're a noble, which is totally a thing you can do, and that's what bluff is for, but the persuasion check in D&D for that situation would be more along the lines of, hey, look, yeah, obviously I'm not a noble, but I need to get in there, because I need to talk to this noble to do a thing for him, and like, have you ever made an exception? Like, just think, as the guard to this establishment, as a bouncer at this club, have you ever made an exception? Have you ever let a dude in? You know what I mean? Like, if you ever let somebody in that wasn't a noble or a hot chick, whatever, switching between medieval and modern here, but have you ever made an exception? And that gets them thinking about it and makes them more likely to think about times that they made exceptions and possibly extend that to you. It's kind of being frank with people. Not a lot of rules in D&D that cover that. I mean, it would be persuasion, but I feel like most DMs would be like, that fails, and wouldn't even think about it, especially if you're using the influence action rules, because you're like, oh, it's not really in here, right? Also, there's not so many things you can do in the middle of a fight to influence people. I think I had a whole video on how to do the influence action intelligently in a fight, because I keep looking this way because I have a screen over here, and that's where my YouTube live stream is. So, and there's nobody watching, which I did not expect anybody to be watching this. This was not a live stream I expected to have people watch. The future live streams, but I'll get to that. But anyway, yeah. So the social pillar I want to design my games with the social pillar in mind, and as much attention to the social pillar as the combat pillar. I also want to keep in mind that there's different ways that people approach the social pillar. So you might have, let's say you have some goblins guarding a cave, and you got two players walk in. Two characters walk in, say, and they're both, bard and a rogue. They're both reasonably charismatic characters. So the bard's player walks in and says, "That's right, laddies. Hey, oh goblin, nay. I know we're not supposed to be here, but listen to me, nay. I think your boss wants to take to us, nay. We came from King Hoositz, and we got a trade deal that we'd like to offer to your chieftain now. And I think your chieftain would like to hear it." And then the other player is not as comfortable doing accents and role-playing as the first player. He just goes, "Yeah, I pull out the evidence of the trade deal and say, yeah, and corroborate that, yeah, we're trying to make a trade deal. Can you please just let us talk to your king?" And I think that both of those approaches are valid and need to be kind of factored in. Because I know a lot of DMs would give bonuses to the player who does the talking, or be like, "Oh, what do you say?" And it gets weird. But different players have different play styles. Some people are comfortable getting into heavy role play like that, and other people want to talk about in the third person about their character separated. Like, my character says something convincing. So, and I want to make sure that the game system doesn't punish you for being one or the other. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Don't punish players for the playstyle that they want. Now let's talk about the exploration pillar. I kind of already mentioned it, but I feel like D&D in recent editions has been throwing the exploration pillar under the bus. It's kind of why we go back to that picture. I don't have exploration, because everybody gets dark vision. So many people get flight. There's ways to avoid needing food. And certain classes have designs around exploration. I know one of my videos, you can check it out. I talk about the rogue. It's like, is the rogue the weakest class? I think the rogue's pretty good. And people are like, "Oh, the rogue is terrible, blah, blah." And it's like, you're completely forgetting exploration. Rogues are the second best exploration class. They're the best exploration class in a dungeon, which is pretty much where exploration rules get used. The ranger is so good at woodland exploration that you don't end up playing woodland exploration with a ranger. If you're gonna do exploration in the wilderness anyway, the ranger just goes, "Oh, is it my favorite terrain? Yeah, then I can't get lost. I automatically find food, and I avoid all encounters." The ranger is so optimized for wilderness exploration, you don't actually get to play where the ranger is good. I think that's one of the reasons the ranger has such a reputation of being a terrible class, because the ranger is so good at his shtick, he gets to skip it. He just skips it entirely. Just, "No, I'm done." We don't have to do that anymore, and that's bad design for exploration. I cannot speak English today. It's bad design for exploration. You want the ranger to get abilities that make it fun to roleplay the exploration part. You want to be like, "All right, here's our rules for wilderness travel. Oh, you're a ranger. This is going to be interesting, and this is going to be fun." Not, "Oh, you're a ranger? Well, I guess we just skip it because your character's too good at this." So you want to avoid that, and I think that that's part of why the exploration pillar kind of got thrown under the bus in D&D and other games. And I was reading through Dungeon World, and it did something. I don't feel like grabbing the Dungeon World book right now, so I'm not going to. But it did something with Tricks of the Trade or Trap Expert, or one of the moves that rogues get. And I have a rogue in the group, so I got to see this firsthand. And they roll, and it's just like, you can ask, are there any traps here? Okay, I disarm the traps. And it's just not as fun as... I mean, one thing 5e did well is the way that you're like, oh, there's a trap here. Okay, well, what do I see? You see, if you're running traps correctly, anyway, you see a kind of the tile here seems to be raised slightly, and there's like a gap underneath it, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna investigate it. Well, it seems to be some sort of a pressure plate. If enough weight gets put on it, it's gonna push down. Like you kind of feel the spring under there. Okay, I'm gonna try to jam pythons in it to disarm it. All right, make it disarm traps or whatever roll you would do to do that. Okay, yeah, you disarm the trap and you're good. But it's like you can kind of play around with, like, if I jam pythons underneath it, it won't go down and therefore won't trigger the thing. Oh, it's a pit? Okay, I'm going to try to jam it closed so we can go across it without it falling on us. And, oh, there's like a lock on that. Okay, well then I can disarm the lock, and then that lock mechanism allows me to disconnect this thing from this thing, and therefore, so that the person had the key, they wouldn't get kicked. It's more fun to do traps that way, kind of as a narrative puzzle experience, than to do traps as second edition kind of ruin traps. Be like, there's a trap? Okay, I have a 35% chance to get rid of traps. Oh look, I rolled a 34. Yay, the trap is disarmed. And I think second edition killed traps for us, and I think Dungeon World inherited a lot of second edition stuff. If you know the history of Dungeon World, it came out around when third edition came out, and I think it was kind of an alternative to third, and they were using second edition, I think, as a heavy influence. As someone who grew up on second edition, I can see that influence all throughout it. If you look at what classes and what races are available to what classes in Dungeon World, you can see some of the second edition, like only humans can be paladins and that kind of thing, being played out within the game rules there. Like only elves and humans can be wizards, because dwarves and halflings couldn't be wizards in second edition D&D. So there's sort of that like aspect of it, and they inherited that bad trap design from second edition, and I think that is also a bad thing for the exploration pillar. You want traps to be puzzles, to be fun puzzles that players can play, or inconveniences in combat that are pretty easy to avoid, but like you have to avoid them. You might be getting thrown into that space by other creatures and things. It's like, oh, there's a pit there. Let's not fall into that. Oh, I'm being hit by a crap. And you go into the pit because you got bull rushed into it. So that's sort of where traps should be, and I think that second ed kind of ruined traps for us. And of course, the way that D&D designs things. All right, I'm going to hit to the conclusion now. So the conclusion here is, if you're designing a game system, you want to bake all three pillars in so that none of the pillars get thrown under the bus. You don't want this situation. You don't want this. You want your pillars to be good. You don't want one pillar to be kind of left behind as the derpy cousin of the other pillars. I hope that wasn't an offensive term. I don't even know. Anyway, so you need to bake these in. So what I'm trying to do is I have some ideas for game design in my head. I'm going to talk about rolling method next week, most likely. And I've got some ideas. I'm heavily influenced by Dungeon World. I like Dungeon World, but Dungeon World's very narrative focused. And I want to get more towards that sort of tactical, crunchy sort of D&D feel that we get from D&D, but not quite as crunchy as D&D. And I said, why are D&D, Pathfinder, Black Flag, OSR, and DW not my solutions? That's sort of the other thing that I have written here. So D&D was my solution because it's, as I've said in other videos, the Schrodinger interpretation of role-playing games. It's the one that we all kind of grew up on. It was one of the first ones out there. I mean, technically the first one, I can't remember the name of it now. It was named after some town in like Western Germany that it took place in, and it was all about like Napoleonic Wars and whatever. But that was the first one. But then D&D shortly came after that. And that was like a one-off, and then I think it was like a one-shot, and then he had a couple of other one-shots in the same place later. But that was it. But D&D was like the first major one that people really got into. And it became the game that we all kind of grew up on, and we all kind of know which edition of D&D you started on kind of dictates a little bit what your expectations of a game are, right? Like, there's a lot of people that are like, oh, there's way too many player options. Well, you started in second ed. Fighters got like, their THAC0 went down and their hit points went up, and that was it. That's what you got when you leveled up, right? So it's that kind of, it's the expectation setter of games. That's why I call it the Schrödinger interpretation. That's a physics reference. I have a master's in physics. Basically, Schrödinger interpretation is how we look at quantum mechanics, because every other interpretation didn't make it, like, made even less sense than the Copenhagen interpretation. Did I say Schrödinger interpretation? Copenhagen interpretation. Schrödinger, that's the cat thing. That's making fun of the Copenhagen, but also the thing that said, hey, no, this is why we do the Copenhagen. Wow, my brain is fried today. But D&D is sort of the Copenhagen interpretation, but it's also about to inherit itself a predatory ecosystem that I don't think that I want to have anything to do with. And I know that Kyle, what's his face, has been making Kyle Brink, is that his name? He's been doing a lot of interviews with YouTubers talking about D&D and trying to rebuild the trust in Wizards of the Coast, which I think he's doing a decent job of it. You can tell he's been coached. But the problem isn't Kyle Brink. The problem isn't Jeremy Crawford. The problem is that they got a guy, Chris Sau, who's from like Zynga, I think, or just definitely from like that mobile gaming environment. And basically they're turning D&D into Dungeons, Shadow Dragons. And it's just not, it's like that level of sort of predatory microtransaction environment, and I just don't want to have anything to do with that. All right, well, that brings me to Pathfinder. Pathfinder 2e. A lot of people going to Pathfinder 2e. If you went to Pathfinder 2e, I don't blame you. But I watched a video, and I don't know where this video is and who wrote it, but it was a video about somebody that was passionate about Pathfinder 2e, explaining 4 of the things that make Pathfinder 2e better than D&D. And I was like, all right, I'm going to watch this video. And all of the things that he thought made Pathfinder 2e better than 5e, I actually thought were worse. The one that comes to, well, the 3-action economy, which apparently people love and they think makes sense, but I already think there's too many actions in a row and too much rolling in D&D, so more actions just make it even a longer wait for a player to get a turn. I might just be saying that because the last D&D game I PC'd in, I played a rogue and everybody else were like spellcasters, and they took forever for their turns, and my turn was over in like a couple minutes. I was just as effective as them. I just did it in 30 seconds. But that's rogue versus other classes. But Pathfinder with the 3-action economy made it seem like it's going to be longer in between players' turns, and that's just more waiting in a slower system. And maybe it's not. Let me know in the comments if you think that it's better than that. It might be, right? Like, if it's better than that, let me know. But the other things they mentioned were, we set the XP as just 1,000 XP per level, and then here's the chart of whether with the difficulty and how much XP you get, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you're linearizing the XP growth, which D&D 5e also does, but because they have that fake old school exponential chart in there, you can just go, all right, if it's a hard encounter, you get 200 XP. If it's a medium encounter, you get 100 XP, and that's it. And always play that way. And then you can slow down advancement as players are getting higher in levels so that you can stay in that sweet spot of like level 3 to 7 and make it really hard to get beyond that, which Pathfinder doesn't let you do. And there was 2 other reasons that he brought up, and I also thought they were bad, but I don't remember what they are. Operation Black Flag. Turns out that's just a different opinion on 1D&D. And at that point, it's like Coke versus Pepsi. And I mean, I guess it's one, predatory ecosystem versus not predatory ecosystem, but there's already some issues I was having with 1D&D, and I had a lot of videos where I was sort of pleading with Jeremy Crawford to do better than what he's doing and what they're doing, and it just wasn't happening. So I don't know if Operation Black Flag is really a thing for me. OSR games are great, but I mean, I played Second Ed, and there's a reason that I don't play Second Ed anymore. And quite frankly, the rolling a d20, I'm over the d20. Sorry, but I'm over you. I'm over you. And I think a different dice rolling method would be good. Dungeon World had a lot of potential for me. You roll 2d6, so it's slightly more mathematically sound than just rolling a d20. It's a little less swingy. And they have a fail state, a partial success state, and a success state, which is great. It's not quite Pathfinder's 4 states, but it's pretty good. But DW, Dungeon World, it focuses a lot on the narrative. So much on the narrative that I feel like it loses that exploration pillar. Because part of Dungeon World is you make up stuff as you go along, and like players can make up stuff and can control the narrative just as much as the DM can. And that is great if you got into D&D because of Critical Role. But if you got into D&D from old school, it's a little bit like, oh, the player just made up what's there, and now we're rolling with that, instead of what is here, right? Like when I run a trap, like I like to set the trap, and then if the players discover it, that's great. Like I had one trap where if you jumped on one pillar, it triggered this other pillar to jam into the ceiling. And if you came at it from a certain direction, that was almost, if you sent one person to scout ahead, that was almost guaranteed to hurt the other 2 people. But they went around a different way and then came at it from a different angle later. And so when they hit it, it did nothing. And you know what? I was fine with that. They accidentally outsmarted my trap, and I was cool with that. But that doesn't feel like a Dungeon World thing to do, because in Dungeon World it's more like, oh, you rolled poorly? Then this pillar goes up in the air, because it's a cool narrative thing. Which is great, again, if you're trying to be Matt Mercer, but if you're trying to be like an old school Grognard, it doesn't quite work out as well. So I want something a little bit more solid in that regard. So Dungeon World is not my solution. So what is my solution? Well, my solution is going to be whatever game we come up with here on YouTube. I'm going to post probably at around 5 o'clock to 5:15 every Thursday, depending on whether or not my daughter has ballet, because she's 4, and we'll be just in here unless she's out. And Thursdays at around 5 is when she has ballet, so I'm going to be posting for Thursdays around 5. This post was a little later than I intended because I tried to elevate my desk so I could stand up while I do this instead of sitting down, because I prefer standing up when I do these videos. But my video card, the video card that's built into this machine, was busted, and I couldn't stream unless I was on the new video card, which has to be low because the video card is in an external unit and has a wire about this long, so it has to be low. So I had to redo my entire setup. And so that took me a good 15-20 minutes. So anyway, that's where I'm at. That's my plan. And I've been talking way too damn long. This is much longer than I expected it to be. So I'm going to leave it there. Like, subscribe, and next Thursday we're going to talk about dice rolling methods. All right. Peace out, everybody.